There is a theory in physics so unsettling that most scientists who encounter it for the first time put it down and walk away. Not because it is wrong, because it might be right. The theory states that for every decision ever made somewhere in the structure of reality, the opposite decision was also made. That every fork in the road is traveled in both directions simultaneously. That somewhere on the other side of an impossible distance, there is a version of everything that went the other way. In 2031, humanity stopped theorizing about it because they found it. The Meridian Deep Space Observatory in the Nevada desert had been operational for 11 years when Dr. Sarah Chen sat down at her station on a Tuesday evening in March with a cold cup of coffee and noticed something in the composite imaging data that should not have been there. She was not looking for it. No one was looking for it because no one believed there was anything to find. She was running a routine comparative analysis of deep space telescope captures when a planet appeared in the data that matched Earth with a precision that the imaging software flagged as a calibration error. It was not a calibration error. She ran the analysis again. She ran it 6 times. She took off her glasses and rubbed her eyes and put them back on, and the images were still identical. The planet on her screen and the planet she had been born on and had lived on for 41 years were the same. Not similar, not analogous, the same. The same continents in the same positions with the same coastlines and the same ocean coverage and the same atmospheric composition and the same gravitational constant and the same axial tilt and the same rotational period and the same magnetic field strength and the same everything. Every measurement that physics could take from this distance matched, every single one. She picked up the phone and called her supervisor and said 4 words. "You need to see this." 72 hours later, she was standing at the head of a conference table in Washington, D.C., presenting data to 12 people who represented every form of authority her civilization had. And the room was silent in the specific way that rooms go silent when the information being presented is too large to have a reaction to yet. She advanced through slide after slide. The military general in the back row wrote nothing on his notepad. He simply stared. Her final slide was a question mark. Nothing else, just a question mark, large, centered, on a white background. She clicked to it and stopped presenting and waited. 6 weeks later, a spacecraft left Earth carrying 3 people into deep space on a mission that the public was told was a geological survey. Commander Marcus Webb had done this 3 times before. He was not a man who frightened easily, having spent 14 years flying things that were not designed to survive the conditions he flew them through. He was 47 years old, and he had the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have learned to function inside fear rather than pretending it is not there. He checked his equipment before launch with the precision of ritual, each item touched and verified. The checklist performed not because he needed to, but because the performance of it was itself a form of preparation. Dr. James Okafor had never been to space. He had spent his entire adult life in xenobiology, the study of life that had not yet been found, preparing for a first contact scenario that his colleagues had called theoretical and his funding committees had called ambitious. He was 38 years old, and he was afraid, and he was trying not to show it, and he was not succeeding. On the morning of launch, he sat at a viewport watching the launch pad and reviewing data he had already reviewed 40 times, and his eyes kept drifting from the tablet to the sky. Dr. Sarah Chen was back in her element. She had found the planet, and she was going to it, and the mathematics of that felt correct in a way that the rest of her life rarely did. She moved through her pre-launch checklist with the same intensity she had brought to that monitor in Nevada. But she paused once, at the crew quarters door, and took out her phone and looked at a photograph of a 12-year-old boy laughing at the camera. She looked at it for exactly 3 seconds. Then she put her phone in her pocket and walked through the door. The journey took 4 months and 17 days. The planet grew in the forward viewport week by week. At first it was a point of light indistinguishable from the stars around it. Then it had color. Then it had shape. Then it had cloud formations. Then it had coasts and oceans and the green of land and the unmistakable blue that belongs to a world with liquid water and an atmosphere and life. And by the time it filled half the viewport and they were 2 weeks from orbital insertion, all 3 of them had stopped talking much because there was not much to say that the planet did not already make obvious simply by existing. They achieved orbit 4 months and 17 days after leaving Earth. From 400 kilometers altitude, it was Earth. There was no other word for it. The shape of North America below them, the Gulf of Mexico, the Mediterranean, the great brown expanse of Central Asia, the ice at the poles, cloud systems moving in the meteorological logic of a planet with this atmosphere at this temperature, with this axial tilt. All of it correct. All of it exactly where it should be. Except. Sarah pressed her palms flat against the viewport glass and traced the eastern seaboard with her fingertip, and it was the right coast in the right place with the right curve and the right peninsulas and the right bays. But the cities. From orbit, the cities were visible as they always are, as concentrations of light and geometry against the organic randomness of nature. And the cities were wrong. Not dramatically wrong, subtly wrong in a way that took several passes over each one to identify. The density patterns were inverted. Where a city should be densest at its center and thin toward its edges, these cities were thinnest at the center and densest at the periphery. Every city on this planet had been built inside out. James's scanner returned 7 billion individual life signs. Marcus read the number aloud once. He did not say it again. The telescope feed pushed to maximum resolution showed them the street level. Vehicles on the wrong side of the road, vehicles with the engine at the back and the storage at the front. Parks at the southern tips of islands instead of their centers. And the buildings, this was the detail that stopped all of them completely. The buildings were entered from the roof. Every building visible had its primary entrance at the top. Staircases descended inward from rooftop doorways. The logic of vertical movement on this planet was downward from entry rather than upward from entry. You went up to get in and down to get where you were going. Sarah looked at the city for a long time. Then she began broadcasting. She sent a mathematical sequence first. Prime numbers in ascending order. The universal language. The one that requires no shared history or shared culture, only shared mathematics. She sent it, and they waited. 40 seconds of silence on the receiver. Then a response. A mathematical sequence. Prime numbers in descending order, starting from where her sequence ended, counting backward to 1. The mirror of what she had sent. The opposite sequence. Over the following 6 hours, they made 847 exchanges and built a shared language from nothing. Simple concepts first. Numbers, directions, basic nouns, then more complex structures. Here, there, us, you, same, different, opposite. James ran the translation in real time, building a working lexicon on his screen, word by word, concept by concept. Marcus slept in his chair and woke when something important happened and slept again when the work became routine. The final exchange of that session, Sarah sent the word for same in their emerging shared language. The planet responded with 2 words that James read from his screen and read again and turned around to show Marcus and Sarah. Not same. The vote to land was 3-0. They were not supposed to land. The mission protocol was explicit. Observe only. No surface contact without direct authorization from Mission Control. But Mission Control was 2.3 light years away and the round-trip communication delay was 4.6 years. And they were 3 people alone with a decision too large for protocol. Marcus voted first, simply and directly, no explanation. James voted second, the scientist in him incapable of not going down there. Sarah looked at the protocol document and then at the planet and said one word and closed the document. The descent vehicle entered the atmosphere. The entry heating built across the heat shield, and through the flames the surface resolved below them. Green, brown, blue along the coast. The landscape of New Jersey, or what should have been New Jersey, spreading beneath them as they descended. They came through the clouds, and the planet was right there, immediate and real, and the first detail Sarah noticed was the trees. The right species, the right general shapes. But every trunk was corkscrewing, not straight. A gentle counterclockwise spiral from the ground to the highest branch, every tree on this planet growing in the opposite rotational direction to trees on Earth. The whole forest below them was a slow corkscrew of green against dark soil. They landed in a wide field, the engines powered down. Silence. Marcus opened the hatch. The air was correct. The temperature was correct. The light was correct. Everything was correct and nothing was correct. Marcus stepped out and planted his left foot and stopped. He stood there for a moment, feeling something about the ground through his boots that he could not immediately name, some wrongness in the proprioceptive feedback that his body registered before his mind could explain it. He took 3 steps and stopped again. The wind was blowing from the east. At this latitude, at this geography, at this season, the prevailing wind should be from the west. This planet rotated in the opposite direction. The sun rose in the west here, it set in the east. James stepped out last and looked up and pointed at the sun, and Marcus followed his finger, and they both stood there for a moment looking at a sun in the wrong part of the sky. They had been watched since entering orbit. A delegation emerged from the tree line 50 meters away. 7 people walking with the calm purposefulness of those who have been waiting and are now doing what they came to do. They were human, entirely, completely, genetically, verifiably human. Same range of heights and builds and features as any 7 people you might pass on a street in any city on Earth. Their formal diplomatic attire had all its buttons on the wrong side and its lapels folding in the wrong direction. Everything correct and mirror reversed. The woman who led the delegation was perhaps 50 years old, with calm, dark eyes and the natural posture of authority. She looked at each of the 3 astronauts for exactly the same amount of time. Then she raised her left hand in greeting, open palm, fingers spread. Marcus raised his right hand. She lowered her left. She raised her right and made the same gesture again, mirroring his correction back at him, showing him the right way to do it here, teaching him in one gesture without a word that this was her world and she was welcoming him to it on its own terms. Marcus lowered his right hand and raised his left. She nodded once. They were taken to the city in silent transport vehicles with the engine at the back. The city from ground level was breathtaking in the way that things built across many generations are breathtaking, carrying every era of their construction in their architecture. They crossed the water on a bridge whose cables fanned downward from road level and anchored into floating pontoons below, holding the road down rather than up. An inverted suspension bridge that worked by the same physics as every bridge on Earth and was built on the exact opposite principle. The streets were immaculate. The traffic moved on the left. The buildings rose dense and tall at the outskirts and gradually opened and thinned as the vehicle moved toward the center until the very heart of the city was a vast open plaza. Parkland, empty space, silence. The most valuable real estate on this planet had been deliberately left empty. The center of everything they had built was nothing. People on the streets stopped and watched the vehicles pass. Some raised their left hands. Marcus raised his left hand back from the window, and he did not stop raising it as they moved through the city and more people raised theirs. The seat of government was a low, unimposing building at the center of the plaza. Inside was a circular meeting hall with no head position, no raised platform for leadership, every seat at the same height facing inward. Sarah and James and Marcus took seats in the circle. The woman who had greeted them sat directly across from Marcus, not at any privileged position, simply opposite. 30 advisors and translators and observers filled the remaining seats. The shared language from 6 hours of orbital exchange was loaded into translation devices on both sides. It was imperfect. It was approximate. It was enough. The woman's name translated approximately as first voice. She spoke, and the translation came in fragments with a 2-second delay, and from those fragments a history assembled itself. This planet was older than Earth by 4 billion years. Life had evolved here first. Intelligence had emerged here first. And at a point in their development that their records marked as the first decision, their civilization had stood at a technological threshold and made a choice. Their records showed what came before it and what came after it, and the shape of that choice visible in everything that followed. The cities built from the outside in, the buildings entered from the top, the infrastructure running on inverted logic, the entire civilization organized around the principle that the center should be empty and the edges should be full. And then they had found Earth. 4 billion years ago, when Earth was still cooling and its surface was still liquid and nothing had yet lived there. They had found it and they had recognized it. A planet identical to theirs in every physical measurement, a blank version of their own world. And they had made a second decision. They had seeded it. They had introduced the biological building blocks. They had set the evolutionary process in motion on a planet that would have eventually arrived at life on its own, but would arrive at it faster with help. They had planted the other version of themselves in the universe, the version that would grow up without any of their history or their choices or their particular way of organizing a city, the version that would make every decision from scratch with no template, with no example to follow or to contradict. They had given Earth humanity, and then they had watched. For 4 billion years they had watched a civilization grow up on the other side of a question mark, making every choice without knowing there was another choice being watched from 2 light years away. Building cities from the center outward, entering buildings from the bottom. Making war. Making peace, destroying things, rebuilding them, arriving at every destination by a completely different road. Humanity was their mirror. Earth was the experiment, and the experimenters were sitting in a circle across from 3 of their subjects, who had finally, after 4 billion years, found their way back to the source. The room was quiet for a long time after the translation finished rendering. Marcus was staring at the floor. James was staring at his notebook without reading it. Sarah was completely still in a way she had not been still since the moment in Nevada when she had taken off her glasses and found that putting them back on changed nothing. Then she looked up. She looked directly at First Voice across the circle. She asked her question through the translation device, and the device rendered it in the mirror language, and First Voice's expression did not change, but something in her eyes shifted. A recognition that this was the question she had been waiting for. Sarah asked, "What did you learn?" First Voice was still for a long moment. The translation of her answer took longer than any previous translation. The device processed it and discarded 2 attempts and rendered a 3rd approximation, and the English text appeared on James's screen, and he read it and handed it to Marcus. And Marcus read it and handed it to Sarah. She read it. She read it again. She looked up at First Voice. She did not speak. She nodded once. The answer, in the closest approximation the imperfect shared language could manage, was this: "Every decision you made that we did not make led to the same place. Every decision we made that you did not make led to the same place. The destination was never the question. The question was always which way you were facing while you were walking there. Before they left, First Voice approached Sarah in the informal gathering after the formal session ended. She held a small, flat object made of material that was not metal or plastic or anything Sarah could immediately name, with a faint internal luminescence, thin and light in the hand. She held it out and Sarah took it with both hands. First Voice said through the translation device, "We have been waiting to give this to you. We were not sure you would come. We hoped you would." The object contained their entire recorded history, 4 billion years of the opposite choice. Every decision made differently documented in full, every outcome recorded, the complete archive of what happens when you build the city from the outside in and enter the buildings from the top and let the wind blow from the east. Sarah held it carefully, not because it looked fragile, because of what it was. They said goodbye in the open plaza as the alien sun moved toward the western horizon. First Voice raised her left hand. Marcus raised his left hand and then, after a moment's visible decision, raised his right hand too. Both hands up. The greeting of both worlds. First Voice looked at his two raised hands and something moved across her face that did not map onto any expression in the vocabulary Sarah had grown up with. Then First Voice raised her right hand to join her left, both hands. Behind her, the entire delegation raised both hands. Behind the delegation, the hundreds of people gathered at the plaza edges raised both hands. The overhead view of that moment, 2 worlds worth of arms reaching upward simultaneously, was a thing that none of the 3 astronauts ever fully described when they returned to Earth, because they could not find language adequate to what it looked like, and they did not want to find inadequate language for it. They ascended as the sun set in the east. From orbit, the planet turned slowly below them, patient and enormous and going about its business in its own direction at its own pace. The cities glowed from their edges. The center of every city was dark. The trees spiraled counterclockwise across the continents. The bridges held their roads down instead of up. The spacecraft moved away from the planet, and the planet grew smaller in the aft viewport, and eventually it was a point of light again, indistinguishable from the stars. And then it was gone. Sarah sat at her station for a long time after it disappeared, the data storage object in her hands, 4 billion years of answers to questions humanity had not yet learned to ask properly. The object was studied extensively after the crew returned to Earth. It took 3 years simply to develop the tools capable of reading the storage format. The translation of the content was estimated to require approximately 300 years to complete. Working groups were established. Committees were formed. Scholars spent careers on single decades of the recorded history. The first major translation that was completed, the section of the record covering the 4 billion years of observation of Earth, was the most read document in human history for the 11 years following its publication. It described humanity in full, from the first single-celled organism to the morning of the day. The 3 astronauts departed with the particular perspective of watchers who had seen it all from a distance too great for interference but close enough for understanding. The description of humanity that this section contained was long and complex and full of nuance, and the scholars argued about its translation for decades. But the final paragraph of that section, the last thing the Mirror civilization had recorded about Earth before the 3 astronauts arrived, translated cleanly and without ambiguity, and was agreed upon by every translator who worked on it independently. It said, "They are almost ready." They did not specify ready for what. The scholars are still working on that section.